Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I want a simple answer. Who owns the home on Ash Grove Lane?
I do, Your Honor.
Objection. That question has already been answered by the deed of record, which lists my client as sole owner.
I'm aware of that, Counselor. I'm asking your client's ex-wife what she believes, and I'm asking her to prove it.
Don't do this, Debra. Not in front of everybody.
Wait, what is she talking about?
Your Honor, if it pleases the court, my client has a document that was never entered into the county record. We'd like it marked as Exhibit 14.
Approach.
Dad, she still has it.
I know.
Mr. Whitfield, you look like a man who already knows what's in that folder. I used to believe that a marriage was something you built the way you build a house. One nail, one Saturday afternoon, one argument about paint colors at a time. I believed that if you put in the work, the roof would hold. I was 34 years old and I still believe that. And that tells you something about how long it takes some of us to learn. For 11 years, I was married to Charles. And for most of those 11 years, I thought the hardest part of my life was already the hardest part, my mother.
Josephine Renard raised me alone in a 2-bedroom rental on the west side of Atlanta, cleaning houses in Buckhead during the week and doing hair out of her kitchen on Saturdays so she could save enough, dollar by dollar, to buy a piece of land that had her name on it and nobody else's. She used to say a black woman who owns her front door owns something the world can't talk her out of. She said it so many times I stopped hearing it as wisdom and started hearing it as background noise, the way you stop hearing a clock ticking in a room you've lived in too long. She bought the house on Ash Grove Lane in 1991. Small brick ranch, 3 bedrooms, a magnolia tree in the front yard that she planted the same week she got the keys. I grew up in that house. I lost my father's photograph in a flood in that house and found it again, warped and faded, tucked behind the water heater. I learned to drive in the gravel lot 2 doors down. When my mother got sick with the cancer that would eventually take her, I moved back into my old bedroom to care for her. And Charles, my husband by then, 3 years in, moved in with me. He was good to her. I want to say that clearly, because everything that came after does not erase what was true before it. Charles Whitfield sat with my mother through chemotherapy appointments that weren't his to sit through. He learned to make her favorite oxtail stew from a recipe she recited to him in a whisper near the end, because by then, she didn't have the strength to stand at the stove and show him herself. When she died, he was the one who picked the casket, because I couldn't make my hands work well enough to point at anything. I tell you this so you understand why, when the lawyers and the family, and eventually the judge, started asking who really owned that house, the question felt less like a legal formality and more like someone asking who really loved my mother. Because in my mind, those two things had become the same question. They were not the same question. That was the first thing I got wrong. If you're the kind of person who finds comfort in stories where the truth is hiding behind a decision an ordinary family made years ago and never talked about again, stay with me. Milan Folktales exists for the moments right before the truth comes out, when everybody in the room still believes their own version of what happened. This is one of those stories. My mother left the house to me. That part was never in dispute, not at first. What became complicated was what happened 4 years after she died, when Charles came to me holding a stack of refinancing papers and a face I had learned to read as worried but trying to hide it. "The roof's going," he said, "and the foundation on the east side needs work before it gets worse. We can pull equity out, fix everything, and still have breathing room." I remember sitting at the kitchen table my mother had eaten her last home-cooked meal at, signing where Charles's brother Michael told me to sign. Michael worked in residential real estate, had for almost 15 years, and our family had learned to treat his opinion on property the way you treat a doctor's opinion on your body, with a kind of automatic trust that skips the part where you ask follow-up questions. "It's cleaner if the loan's just in Charles's name," Michael told us both, flipping through the paperwork with the practiced boredom of a man who had done this 100 times. "Your credit's still recovering from the medical bills, Debra, no offense. This way the rate's better, closing's faster, and once it's paid down, you two can retitle it however you want. It's a formality. A formality. I have turned that word over so many times since then that it has lost its shape in my mouth. The way any word does when you say it enough. I signed a quitclaim deed that day. I did not fully understand, in the way you don't fully understand a thing you're eager to be done with, that a quitclaim deed doesn't transfer a loan. It transfers ownership. Charles promised me, standing right there in that kitchen with his brother's paperwork spread across the table my mother used to iron pillowcases on, that once the refinance was settled and our credit was rebuilt together, he'd put my name back on the deed. "It's still your mother's house," he said. "This is just paper, Debra. It doesn't change what's real." He wrote it down, too. Not because I asked him to, because I cried, and he felt bad, and writing it down was easier than sitting with a woman crying at her dead mother's kitchen table. He took a sheet of my mother's old recipe stationery, the kind with a faded rooster in the corner, and wrote 3 sentences in his neat, slanted handwriting, that the house at Ashgrove Lane had been purchased and maintained substantially, with funds and inheritance belonging to Debra Renard Whitfield, that the refinance and title transfer were a temporary financial convenience, and that full ownership would be restored to her name upon completion of the loan or upon request. He signed it. His sister Kelly, who happened to be visiting that weekend, signed it too, as a witness, mostly because Charles asked her to, and she didn't think to say no. I folded that piece of paper into an old cookbook of my mother's and did not think about it again for 6 years. That was the second thing I got wrong. Not writing it down. He'd done that. My mistake was believing a piece of paper folded into a cookbook was the same as a piece of paper filed at the county courthouse. I thought love came with an assumption of follow-through. I was 34. I had a lot to learn about the distance between a promise and a document. Charles's family did not dislike me in those years. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easier to tell you they always resented me, that the second wife was inevitable from the beginning, that I should have seen it coming. That's not true. Charles's mother had passed before I met him, but his father, Steve, treated me like a daughter from the first Thanksgiving I spent at his table, teaching me his method for smoking a turkey that took 4 days and produced results he refused to explain to anyone else in the family. Michael and I argued about football and nothing else. Kelly and I got our nails done together on the first Saturday of every month for almost a decade. What changed wasn't the family. What changed was Charles. I don't know the exact week it started, the way you rarely know the exact week a foundation begins to crack, because it happens beneath the part of the house you can see. I know that by year 9 he had stopped coming home for dinner without a reason attached to it. I know that by year 10, the reasons had a name, and the name was Joanna Pierce, a project coordinator at the engineering firm where Charles had worked his way up to regional manager. I met Joanna exactly once before the divorce, at a company holiday party Charles hadn't wanted me to attend. She was younger than me by 6 years, sharp in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty, the kind of sharp that comes from having grown up needing to notice things quickly. She shook my hand and told me she loved my dress. I believed her. I didn't yet know she'd end up living in my mother's house, sleeping in the room where I once nursed Josephine Renard through her final Christmas, with no idea that any of that history belonged to the walls around her. Joanna did not know, either, that Charles had told his family a very different story than the one that was actually true. I would learn this much later, in a deposition room with fluorescent lighting and a court reporter's fingers moving faster than either of us could keep up with. But at the time, all I knew was that within 18 months, Charles had left our marriage, moved into what I still believed was our house, together with Joanna, and the family that had once passed me the good china at Thanksgiving had started referring to me, in group texts I wasn't supposed to see, as the situation. The divorce itself was almost unremarkable. Georgia is what's called an equitable distribution state, which sounds fairer than it is. Charles's lawyer, a compact, unhurried man named Reginald Vance, made a simple argument in the mediation room. The marital home at Ashgrove Lane was titled solely in Charles Whitfield's name, had been for 6 years, and Debra Whitfield had no documented financial interest in the property post-refinance. I sat across the table from Charles for the first time in months, close enough to see that he had started wearing his hair differently, close enough to see that he would not quite look at me. "You know that's not what happened," I said. "I know what the deed says," Charles said, and something in the careful flatness of his voice told me he had rehearsed the sentence. I'm sorry it feels unfair. But paper is paper, Debra. Paper is paper. The same man who had once told me paper didn't change what was real, was now telling me paper was the only thing that mattered. I understood, in that moment, that he had built himself a story in which he was not a man who had broken a promise, but a man who had simply followed the correct legal process, and that his family had helped him build it, plank by plank, the same way I had once believed we were building a marriage. I did not have a lawyer who specialized in property at that point, just a general practice divorce attorney who told me, not unkindly, that without documentation, an equitable claim on a solely titled asset was going to be an uphill fight, and that I should think hard about whether I had the money and the stomach to fight it. I went home that night, to the small rented apartment I'd moved into, not to Ashgrove Lane, because Charles had asked me, with something that might have been guilt, to let him and Joanna get settled before I came by to collect the last of my things. And I sat on the floor of my empty bedroom, and I tried to remember every box I had packed since my mother died. I remembered the cookbooks. I still had them. All of them, including the one with the rooster on the end papers, sitting in a moving box in a storage unit off Cascade Road, that I had been too tired and too heartbroken to go through. I did not go get that box that week. I want to tell you I did, because it would make a better story, a faster one. But grief doesn't move at the speed of plot. It took me 4 more months, and a phone call from Kelly that I did not expect, before I understood what I was actually looking for. I met Charles Whitfield, the way most people meet the person who ends up shaping the rest of their story. By accident, at a moment I wasn't paying attention to my own life. I was 26, working the front desk at a physical therapy clinic in East Point, and he came in twice a week for 6 weeks after tearing something in his shoulder playing weekend basketball with men half his age acting like it was the NBA Finals. He was easy to talk to in a way that didn't feel like a performance. He asked about my mother the 2nd week, remembered her name the 3rd, and by the 6th week, he'd asked me to dinner with the kind of nervousness that told me he didn't do this often. I liked that about him. I liked that he wasn't smooth. Smooth men had always made me suspicious, the way my mother had raised me to be suspicious of anything that came too easily. Charles came slowly, carefully, the way a man builds something he intends to keep. We married 2 years later, in my mother's backyard, under the magnolia tree that was already, by then, taller than either of us. Josephine Renard cried through the entire ceremony and told everyone within earshot that she'd finally gotten a son who knew how to fix a leaking faucet without being asked twice. I remember thinking, standing under that tree in a dress my mother had helped me pick out, that I had done everything right. I had waited. I had watched. I had chosen a man who showed up early instead of one who talked a good game. For a long time, I was right about him. That's the part I still have to remind myself of, on the harder days. That being wrong about how a story ends doesn't erase the years where you were reading it correctly. Charles drove me to the hospital at 2 a.m, 3 separate times, during the worst of my mother's chemotherapy, without complaint, without once making it about his own exhaustion. He learned the names of every nurse on the oncology floor. He held my mother's hand in the final week, when I had stepped out to cry in the hallway because I couldn't let her see my face fall apart, and he told her, in a voice I overheard through the half-open door, that he would always look after her house, because it was the house that had raised the woman he loved. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else he ever said to me. He would always look after her house. I used to hear it as devotion. Somewhere in the years that followed, without either of us quite noticing the shift, looking after the house became something closer to taking it, and I don't think Charles himself could tell you the exact day one turned into the other. Kelly called me on a Tuesday in March, almost a year after the divorce was finalized. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken since the family holiday party where she'd hugged me a little too long and then avoided my eyes for the rest of the night. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to not tell Michael I called you. Okay? Joanna asked me something last week, about the house, about why there's a room upstairs that still has your mother's wallpaper in it, even though Charles told her the house had always been his family's." I sat very still. "What did you tell her?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "I told her I didn't know," Kelly said. I lied to her, Debra, because I didn't want to be the one who blew everything up. Another pause. But I still have the letter. The one Charles wrote you. At the kitchen table. The day y'all signed the refinance. I was there. I signed it too. I never told anybody I kept my copy. I had forgotten, in the fog of that year, that Kelly had made her own copy that day, folding it into her purse, almost absent-mindedly, while Charles and Michael discussed loan terms across the table. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. And it came out flatter than I meant it to, more accusation than question. "Because Joanna's starting to ask the questions I should have asked 11 years ago," Kelly said. "And because my father hasn't slept right since Christmas. And because I'm tired of being the quiet one in a family that's been quiet about the wrong thing for a long time." She didn't send me the letter that night. She said she needed to think about what it would cost her. Her relationship with Charles, with Michael, with a family that had built an entire narrative around Debra, the woman who walked away. But she planted something in me that had been dormant since the day I'd signed my name at that table. The understanding that I was not the only person who remembered what had actually happened. Somewhere in this family, there was a version of the truth that had never made it into any courtroom. I drove to the storage unit off Cascade Road the next morning. I found the box of cookbooks under a stack of my mother's church hats. I found the Rooster cookbook on the third try, and inside its warped, water-stained cover, folded into quarters exactly the way I'd left it, was the letter Charles had written at that kitchen table 11 years earlier, in his neat, slanted handwriting, promising me something he had apparently decided, somewhere along the way, that he no longer had to keep. I did not know yet what that letter could do. I did not know that it would take a courtroom, a forensic accountant, 3 depositions, and 1 devastating discovery about my own mistakes before anyone would understand its full weight. I only knew, standing in that dusty storage unit with my mother's handwriting on the cookbook cover and Charles's handwriting inside it, that I was done letting other people decide what was real. I hired a new lawyer in April. Her name was Alex Dunca, and she came recommended by a coworker who'd used her in a business dispute and described her, memorably, as the kind of lawyer who reads the footnotes. Alex was in her early 40s, wore reading glasses on a chain she never actually used, and had a habit of going quiet for long stretches while she thought, which unsettled me at first and then became the thing I trusted most about her. I brought her the letter, the cookbook, and everything else I could find. Old bank statements showing the inheritance transfer from my mother's estate into the joint account Charles and I had shared. Receipts for the roof repair and the kitchen renovation we'd done together in year 7. Photographs of the magnolia tree my mother had planted, dated on the back in her own handwriting. Ashgrove Lane, our first spring, 1991. Alex read all of it twice before she said anything. "This isn't nothing," she finally said. "But it isn't everything either. A handwritten letter, even a witnessed one, isn't a deed. What it can do, if we can show a pattern of financial contribution to back it up, is support a claim for what Georgia law calls a resulting trust, or an equitable interest based on unjust enrichment. Essentially, we argue that even though your name isn't on the current title, the money and intent behind that title tell a different story than the paper does. Can we win?" Alex took her glasses off, which I had learned by then meant she was about to tell me something I needed to actually hear. "I think we can prove you have a real, provable stake in that house. I don't think you should walk in here believing you're going to walk out owning all of it outright. Juries and judges don't like clean stories, Debra. They like evidence. Let's build you evidence, not a narrative." I didn't fully understand what she meant by that until much later. At the time, I mostly heard the first part, a real, provable stake, and let myself feel something I hadn't felt in over a year, the beginning of ground under my feet. If you've ever watched somebody you love build an entire understanding of you out of a story that isn't true, you already know what the next few months were like. Because before we ever got near a courtroom, I had to sit through what Alex called discovery, and what I privately came to think of as the excavation. Charles's attorney, Reginald Vance, filed a motion to have the claim dismissed outright, arguing that a decade-old, unfiled handwritten letter had no legal standing against a recorded deed. Alex fought it and won. Not a victory on the merits, just the right to be heard, but it felt, in that moment, like the entire war. Then came the depositions. Michael sat across from Alex in a conference room downtown, his tie a little too tight, and answered every question about the 2015 refinance with the practiced ease of a man who'd told this story to himself so many times he half believed it. Yes, he'd recommended the loan structure. Yes, he'd told Debra it was a formality. No, he did not recall Charles writing any kind of letter that day. "Mr. Whitfield," Alex said, sliding a photocopy across the table, "do you recognize this handwriting?" I watched something move behind Michael's eyes. Not shock, because he had clearly known Kelly kept a copy, or at least suspected it, but something closer to exhaustion, the look of a man setting down a bag he'd been carrying for a long time. "That's my brother's handwriting," Michael said quietly. "And do you recall being present when it was written?" A pause. His lawyer, Reginald, sat in on the deposition too, watching carefully, said nothing, because there was nothing objectionable about the question, only something uncomfortable about the answer. "I was in the kitchen," Michael said. "I didn't read what he wrote. I assumed it was just him trying to make Debra feel better about the paperwork." He looked up, and for the first time in the deposition, looked directly at me instead of at Alex. "I told y'all it was a formality because that's what I believed at the time. I didn't think it would end up mattering 11 years later. People will tell you a small lie feels harmless right up until the day it becomes the only wall holding up a much bigger one," my mother used to say, though she was usually talking about church gossip, not real estate law. I thought about that line more than once during those depositions. Joanna's deposition was harder to sit through, though not for the reasons I expected. I had built a version of her in my mind over the previous year. Not a villain exactly, Alex had warned me against that kind of thinking, but a woman who had known enough and chosen not to ask more. What I found instead, watching her answer questions in a small windowless room with her own attorney beside her, was someone who looked increasingly unsettled by her own answers. "When did you first move into the Ashgrove Lane property?" Alex asked. "About 14 months after Charles and Debra separated," Joanna said. "Did Charles ever tell you how the house was acquired?" "He said it had been in his family, that his mother had owned property in that area, and it eventually came to him." A pause. "He said Debra had contributed to some renovations over the years, but that the house itself had always been his." I watched Joanna's jaw tighten slightly as she said it, the way a person's face moves when they're hearing their own words land differently than they expected. "Ms. Pierce, are you aware there's an upstairs bedroom in that house, still papered in a pattern from the early 1990s? "Yes." Joanna's voice had gone quieter. "I asked him about that room once. He said it used to belong to a cousin growing up. And do you know whose handwriting is on the back of the photographs currently stored in the hallway closet of that home? The ones showing a magnolia tree being planted in 1991? Reginald objected, relevance. And the judge presiding over the deposition, a magistrate handling pretrial matters, allowed the question to stand for the record, but noted the objection. Joanna didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had lost whatever composure it started with. "I don't know," she said. "I never looked." I didn't feel triumphant watching that exchange. I felt something closer to recognition. I had believed, for a while, that Charles's cover story about our marriage existed only for his family and for the judge. It hadn't occurred to me, until that room, that he had built an entirely separate version of events for the woman who now slept in my mother's house. One where I was a minor contributor to a home that had always, conveniently, belonged to him and his family alone. Joanna had not married a liar knowingly. She had married a man who had gotten so good at revising the past that he'd stopped being able to tell her, or maybe even himself, which version was true. Sometimes the cruelest thing a person does isn't to the one they leave. It's to the one they bring along afterward, handing her a story with the difficult parts quietly removed, I told my sister on the phone that night, and she told me to write it down before I forgot it, because it sounded like something my mother would have said. Nearly 7 months into the case, right after Joanna's deposition, is when the second thing happened that I hadn't seen coming, not from Charles's family this time, but from inside my own account of events. Alex called me into her office on a Thursday with a folder I didn't recognize. "I need you to look at something," she said, "and I need you to be honest with me about what it means, because opposing counsel already has it, and he's going to use it." It was a printout of a text message exchange from 6 years earlier, the year before Charles and I formally separated, during the worst stretch of our marriage, back when we'd been fighting about money and his growing distance almost nightly. I remembered the fight the message came from, though I'd forgotten I'd sent it. I had written, at 11 at night, exhausted and furious after another argument about the mortgage payment. Fine. Keep the house. Keep everything. I don't care anymore. I stared at the screen for a long time. I said that, I admitted. I was angry. We made up 2 days later. I didn't mean it as some kind of legal statement. I believe you, Alex said. But Reginald Vance is going to argue it demonstrates you understood and accepted, in your own words, that the house belonged to Charles alone, and that you relinquished any claim to it voluntarily, years before the divorce. I felt something in me want to fold in on itself, the particular shame of watching a moment of private pain get held up as evidence, stripped of the context that made it survivable. That's not what happened, I said. That's not what it meant. I know, Alex said. But you're going to have to explain that to a judge, in a courtroom, under oath, in a way that a stranger who's never met you finds believable. That's not the same as it being true. I need you ready for that. That was the moment I understood, more clearly than at any point before it, that this case was not going to hand me a clean victory. I had trusted too easily. I had avoided confrontation for years rather than insist on paperwork, insisted on believing my husband's promises instead of filing them. And now, on top of that, I had a moment of raw, human anger from the worst night of my marriage, waiting to be read back to me by a lawyer trying to convince a judge it meant something it never meant. Some truths don't need a villain to hurt you. Sometimes the truth is just that you were human at the worst possible moment, and somebody kept the receipt. I didn't say that one out loud to anyone. I wrote it in the Notes app on my phone at 2 a.m. and left it there. If any of this feels familiar, the slow, sick realization that a story you told yourself about your own life wasn't quite complete, I'd ask you to stay with me a little longer, because the courtroom hadn't even started yet, and neither had the parts even Alex Duncan hadn't seen coming. Milan Folktales will be here when the truth finally gets its day, and I promise you, it isn't the truth any of us expected walking in. By late summer, I had let myself believe I understood the shape of the case. I had the letter. I had the bank records showing my mother's inheritance funding the down payment. I had Michael's deposition, in which he'd admitted, however reluctantly, to calling the loan structure a formality. I believed the trial would be about proving Charles had lied. What I did not yet understand, what none of us fully understood, not even Alex, until 3 weeks before trial, was that the truth wasn't only about who had lied. It was about who had known something and said nothing, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with malice, and everything to do with fear of what the truth would cost them. Steve, Charles's father, had not spoken to me directly since the divorce. He'd sent a card when my mother's estate was finally settled, 4 words in his careful handwriting: Josephine deserved better, and nothing else. I hadn't understood, at the time, whether he meant better than cancer, or better than what had happened to her house after she was gone. 3 weeks before trial, Steve called Alex's office and asked to speak with me directly. Not through lawyers, just the 2 of us, at the diner on Cascade Road where he used to take me for pie after church, back when I still had a father-in-law, instead of an opposing party's witness list. I almost didn't go. Alex told me it was my call to make, that nothing said outside a deposition would carry the same weight, but that if he had information relevant to the case, it needed to come to her eventually regardless. I went anyway. Some things you do for the case. Some things you do because an old man once smoked a turkey for 4 days to make you feel like you belonged somewhere. Steve was already in the booth when I arrived. An untouched cup of coffee in front of him, looking smaller than I remembered. I should have said something a long time ago, he said, before I'd even sat down. Said something about what? I asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Steve turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, a habit I remembered from 100 Thanksgivings. About the loan, he said. About what your mother's money actually paid for. About the fact that I was the one who told Charles, back when your mama first got sick, that if he was smart, he'd make sure the property ended up cleaner in his name only, once the refinance came through. I thought I was protecting my son. I told myself it was practical advice, the kind a father's supposed to give. He finally looked up at me. I didn't think about what it would take from you. I told myself it was just paperwork, same as Michael did. I've had 11 years to think about what that word cost you, and I'm ashamed of how easy it was to say. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside the diner window, the Atlanta traffic moved the way it always did, indifferent to the fact that an old man was confessing something at a Formica table that could change the outcome of a lawsuit. Why are you telling me now, Steve, and not Alex, 3 weeks before trial when it might actually help? Because I am telling Alex, he said. I called her office this morning, before I called you. I'm going to testify, if she'll have me. I just needed to say it to your face first, because you deserve that more than you deserve a legal filing. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the table between us. A small spiral notebook, the kind he'd always kept in his truck for job estimates back when he did contracting work. I kept notes from back then. Dates. What I told him. What he told me about how the loan was structured, and why. I don't know if it's the kind of evidence lawyers care about, but it's what actually happened, written down closer to when it happened than anything else you've got. I picked up that notebook with hands that weren't entirely steady, and I understood, sitting in that booth, that the case had just changed shape one more time. Not because Charles had been caught in a lie, exactly, but because an entire family had spent over a decade quietly agreeing not to look too closely at a decision they'd made together, and one by one, they were running out of room to keep not looking. The trial began on a Tuesday in October, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Fulton County courthouse, in front of a judge named Miriam Okafor, who had a reputation, Alex told me, for being unhurried, precise, and entirely unmoved by theatrics. Reginald Vance opened by reminding the court of the only fact he needed to be true. The deed to Ashgrove Lane, recorded in 2015, listed Charles Whitfield as sole owner. Everything else, he argued, was sentiment dressed up as evidence. An old letter with no legal force, a father's guilty conscience, a decade-old text message in which the plaintiff herself had explicitly relinquished any claim to the property. Alex opened differently. She didn't ask the court to forget what the deed said. She asked the court to consider what the deed didn't say, where the money came from, what promises accompanied the paperwork, and whether a title, once it stops matching the truth of who actually built and paid for a home, deserves to be treated as the final word. I testified for most of a day. I explained the down payment, the inheritance, the years of mortgage payments split between us before the refinance, the renovation I'd paid for out of my own savings the year we redid the kitchen. I explained, as steadily as I could manage, the text message from the worst night of my marriage, that it was said in anger, retracted within 48 hours, never followed by any legal action, any request to remove my name from anything, because at the time there had been nothing left to remove me from. My name wasn't on the account being fought over that night at all, which was, I realized as I said it out loud in that courtroom, its own kind of evidence. I hadn't relinquished a claim. I had been angry about a house I already, wrongly, believed I no longer had any legal claim to, which meant the message proved the opposite of what Reginald wanted it to prove. It proved I didn't understand my own rights, not that I'd voluntarily surrendered them. Michael testified next, more forthcoming under oath than he had been in his deposition, describing the 2015 loan structure and admitting, under Alex's careful questioning, that he had advised Charles at the time that keeping the title solely in his name would simplify things down the road if the marriage ever ran into trouble. Testimony that shifted the room noticeably because it suggested intent that went beyond a simple loan formality. Reginald Vance tried on cross-examination to soften the damage. Mr. Whitfield, isn't it true that recommending sole name financing for credit reasons is standard practice in your industry? It can be, Michael said, but that's not the only reason I gave that day. I told my brother it would be cleaner if things ever went bad between him and Debra. That's not a lending recommendation. That's family advice dressed up as one. He glanced briefly at Charles, who was sitting very still at the defense table. I've spent 11 years telling myself I didn't know what I was really doing when I said it. Sitting here, under oath, I can't keep telling myself that. Reginald tried once more. You have no documentation of any of this beyond your memory and your father's notebook, correct? Correct, Michael said. But I remember the kitchen. I remember the table. I remember exactly what I said, because I've replayed it more times than I'd like to admit. Judge Okafor made a note. It was a small gesture, easy to miss if you weren't watching for it. But Alex told me afterward that it was the first moment she felt confident the court was actually hearing us, rather than simply letting us speak. Steve testified after him, notebook in hand, walking the court through dated entries from 11 years earlier, describing conversations with his son about protecting the property just in case. Conversations that had happened while my mother was still alive, months before she'd even died, which meant the plan to eventually isolate the title in Charles's name predated her death. Predated, even, the refinance that had supposedly made it necessary. That was the detail nobody had fully understood until Steve's notebook made it plain. This hadn't been a reactive decision made during a financial emergency. Some of it had been planned, quietly, in advance, by a family that loved Charles and had decided, without ever quite saying it aloud, that protecting him meant not fully protecting me. Kelly testified last among the family witnesses, confirming she'd witnessed the letter, that she'd kept her own copy for 11 years, out of a discomfort she couldn't fully name at the time, and that she had eventually reached out to me because she could no longer reconcile the family's story with what she'd personally watched happen at that kitchen table. Joanna did not testify against Charles. I want to be clear about that, because it would be a cheaper story if she had walked into that courtroom and delivered some dramatic reversal, choosing truth over her relationship in a single cinematic moment. That's not what happened, and Milan Folktales doesn't deal in what's easy. What happened instead was smaller, and in some ways harder to watch. Joanna was called as a witness by Alex, not Charles's side, and she answered every question honestly, about what Charles had told her regarding the house's history, about the conversation regarding the upstairs bedroom, about the photographs in the hallway closet, she said. This time, she had finally looked at. I found them a few months ago, Joanna said, her voice even but strained. After the deposition, I went looking, because I couldn't stop thinking about the wallpaper. There's a whole box of photographs of a woman I don't know, in that house, at every stage of it being built into a home. I recognized her handwriting on the back before I ever met Debra's mother in any photograph, because it's the same handwriting on some old recipe cards still in the kitchen drawer. She looked, briefly, toward Charles, who did not meet her eyes. I don't think Charles lied to me about being divorced, or about wanting a life with me. I think he lied to me about what home meant, in a way that made it easier to justify everything else. She didn't say it to hurt him. She said it like someone finally setting down a bag she hadn't realized she was carrying. The same look I'd seen on Michael's face months earlier. I did not feel vindicated watching her testify. I felt, mostly, sad. For both of us. Two women who had trusted the same man's account of his own life, and found, on separate timelines, that the account had been edited for their comfort, rather than written for the truth. Judge Okafor did not rule from the bench that day. She took the matter under advisement for 11 days. 11 days in which I did not sleep well, in which I thought more than once about the magnolia tree, about whether it was even still alive, about whether Joanna had ever asked Charles why there was a tree in the front yard older than their relationship, and shaped, if you looked closely, almost like a person standing with her arms slightly raised. When the ruling came, it was not the sweeping vindication I might have imagined during the angriest months of that year. Judge Okafor found that the letter, corroborated by Steve's notebook, Michael's testimony, and the documented flow of inheritance funds into the property, established a resulting trust in Debra Whitfield's favor. Not full ownership by default, but a clear, quantifiable, equitable interest reflecting both the original down payment and years of documented financial contribution to the mortgage and improvements. She calculated that interest, based on the evidence presented, at just over 60% of the property's value, with the remaining share belonging to Charles, reflecting his own financial contributions during the years they were married and afterward. She was careful, in her written opinion, to note what the ruling was not. It was not a finding that Charles Whitfield had committed fraud. It was a finding that a family, acting on a mix of practical convenience and quiet self-interest, had allowed a piece of paper to drift further and further from the truth it was supposed to represent, until a promise made at a kitchen table 11 years earlier finally had to answer for itself in a room none of them had ever wanted to be in. The court ordered the property either sold, with proceeds divided according to the established interests, or refinanced with Charles buying out Debra's majority share at fair market value, whichever the parties could agree to within 90 days. Charles and I met once more, outside of lawyers' offices, at the house itself, the week before it went on the market. He'd agreed, in the end, that neither of us wanted to fight over a buyout he couldn't actually afford. Joanna had, quietly, told him she didn't want to live in a house that had cost this much to keep. They were looking at a place across town, somewhere with no history attached to either of us. I walked through Ashgrove Lane one final time before the sale, room by room, the way you walk through a memory when you know you're about to lose the physical version of it. The upstairs bedroom still had my mother's wallpaper. The kitchen still had the table, though the chairs had changed twice since we'd married. Someone, Joanna, I assumed, had kept the photographs in the hallway closet exactly where they'd always been, arranged now with a small, careful order that suggested someone had gone through them one at a time and, eventually, learned to see my mother's whole life inside them. Charles was waiting for me by the magnolia tree when I came back outside. It was still alive. Bigger than I remembered, its branches heavier, the way things get when nobody's paying close attention to how much time has actually passed. I told myself a lot of things over the years, Charles said, not quite looking at me, the same way he hadn't looked at me across the mediation table 2 years earlier. That it was simpler this way, that you'd understand, eventually, that it wasn't personal. I don't think I ever let myself really look at what I was asking you to give up. He paused. I'm sorry, Debra. Not because a judge made me say it, because standing here, I can actually see it. I didn't forgive him in that moment. Not fully. Not in the way people mean when they want a story to end cleanly. But I believed him, and I understood that belief and forgiveness are not always the same transaction. You didn't just take a house from me, Charles, I said. You tried to take my mother's whole existence and edit her out of your version of our life together, because it was easier than admitting what you owed both of us. I looked up at the magnolia tree, at branches my mother's hands had once been small enough to reach. I'm not angry that you fell in love with somebody else. People do that. I'm angry that it took a courtroom to make you remember whose house you were standing in. He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't need him to. I used my share of the proceeds, 6 months later, to open a small bakery on the same stretch of road where my mother used to do hair out of her kitchen on Saturdays, not far from Ashgrove Lane, close enough that I drive past the house sometimes, close enough to see, in early spring, the magnolia tree in full bloom above a roofline that belongs to somebody else's family now. I named the bakery Josephine's. I kept one recipe card, water-stained and faded, framed on the wall behind the register, not because I need the recipe anymore, I know it by heart, but because some things deserve to stay visible, instead of folded into a cookbook where nobody thinks to look for them until it's almost too late. Kelly still gets her nails done with me on the first Saturday of the month. Steve comes by the bakery most Sundays for a slice of pound cake and stays long enough to tell me, every single time, that it isn't quite as good as his turkey, which we both know is a lie he tells because it makes us laugh. Joanna and I are not friends, exactly, but we exchanged a single email after the sale closed, in which she told me she'd kept one photograph of my mother, the one from the first spring, and asked if I wanted it back. I told her to keep it. Some things are better held by the people who finally understood, even late, what they were actually looking at. I don't own Ashgrove Lane anymore. For a long time, I thought that meant I had lost. I understand it differently now. What I actually won wasn't the house. It was the right to tell my own story about it. About my mother, about 11 years of a marriage that was real, even in the parts that ended badly. About a family that chose comfort over truth for a long time, and, eventually, chose truth anyway, because the people inside it got tired of carrying a lie that had never really belonged to them in the first place. A house is just proof that people were willing to build something together. The deed only tells you who's allowed to walk through the front door. It never tells you who actually made the place worth walking into. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't get talked about enough. The grief of discovering that the people who love you can also, quietly, choose convenience over your dignity, not out of cruelty, but because looking away is easier than standing beside you when it costs them something. Steve looked away. Michael looked away. Even Kelly, for a long time, looked away. None of them were monsters. All of them, eventually, had to live with what looking away had cost. There's another kind of grief in this story, too. One that belongs to Joanna. She is not the villain some of you may have wanted her to be. And if that disappoints you, sit with why. We are trained by 100 other stories to want a woman to blame, when the truth is usually a man who got skilled at telling two different women two different histories, and calling both of them love. And there's a lesson here for Debra, and maybe for you. Trust is not the enemy of protection. You can love someone with your whole chest and still put your name on the paperwork. You can believe in a promise and still ask for it in writing. Josephine Renard used to say that a woman who owns her front door owns something the world can't talk her out of. And the version of that wisdom Debra had to learn the hard way is that ownership isn't just about the buying. It's about the documenting, the following through, the refusal to let a promise stay folded in a cookbook where only love, and never the law, can find it. The house on Ashgrove Lane still stands. The magnolia tree still blooms every spring, the way it has since 1991, indifferent to whose name is on the deed. Some things outlast the paperwork, but if you want the law to remember what your heart already knows, write it down, file it, and follow through. That's not the absence of love. That's what protecting it actually looks like. If this story stayed with you, you know where to find the next one. Milan Folktales will be here.